안녕하세요, 여러분. 오늘은 생태관광의 국제적 흐름과 생태관광 숙박시설 사례를 글렌 잠폴 님을 모시고 배워보도록 하겠습니다. 오늘 말씀해 주실 글렌 잠폴에 대해서 잠시 말씀 소개해 드리도록 하겠습니다. 글렌 잠폴은 미국 국적을 가지고 계시지만 코스타리카에서 오랫동안 생활을 하셨습니다. 그래서 미국과 코스타리카 국적을 모두 가지고 계시고요. 현재는 코스타리카에서 지내고 계십니다. 2015년부터 국제생태관광네트워크의 회장님을 맡고 계십니다. 국제생태관광네트워크는 글로벌 이코투리즘 네트워크라고 하는데요. 전 세계적으로 여러 곳에 지역 네트워크가 있습니다. 그중 하나로 라틴 아메리카와 카브리해 생태관광 네트워크도 최근에 결성이 되었고 이 네트워크 결성에 주도적으로 참여를 하셨습니다. 그 과거 경력을 잠시 말씀을 드리면 2006년부터 2013년까지 코스타리카 생태관광협회의 회장님을 맡으시면서 여러 가지 생태관광 개발과 또 지속가능한 발전을 위해서 국내외적으로 활동을 하셨습니다. 2004년부터 2015년까지 국제생태관광협회 이사님도 맡고 계셨는데요. 국제생태관광협회는 영어로 타이즈라고 불렸습니다. 오랫동안 생태관광의 개념 정의, 또 생태관광의 세계적인 확장 등에 있어서 이 국제생태관광협회가 많은 일을 하였지만 안타깝게도 현재는 협회로서의 기능은 전혀 하지 않고 개인 회사로 변경되어 있습니다. 이런 변화와 관련해서 국제생태관광 네트워크, 즉 젠이라고 부르는 기관이 새롭게 2015년도에 설립되었습니다. 잠시 후에 설명드리겠지만 코스타리카는 세계적으로 아주 선도적으로 생태관광 분야를 포함한 지속가능 관광이라는 이름 하에서 인증 제도를 시행하고 있습니다. 이 국가인정위원회가 코스타리카에도 결성되어 있는데 이 인정위원회에서 또 리더 역할을 오랫동안 하셨습니다. 글렌 잠폴은 국제생태관광 네트워크뿐만이 아니라 개인적으로 2개의 에코라지를 갖고 계시고요. 또 이 에코라지에서 같이 커피 농장도 운영하고 계십니다. 말씀드린 것처럼 코스타리카에는 지속가능 관광 인증 프로그램이 국가 주도로 1997년부터 운영이 되었는데요. 이 인증에서 최고 수준의 평가를 받은 에코라지를 운영하고 계십니다. 보시는 바와 같이 2개의 에코라지가 코스타리카에서 운영되고 있습니다. 오늘 에코라지, 생태 숙박시설이란 무엇인지 또 어떻게 운영하셨길래 최고 등급을 받으셨는지도 간단하게 설명을 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 밑에서 보시는 것처럼 세계적으로 유명한 콘데나스트 트래블러 리더스에서도 아주 훌륭한 소형 호텔로 평가를 받은 바 있고요. 내셔널 지오그래픽에 의해서도 아주 독특한 숙박시설로 인정을 받아서 인증서를 획득하였습니다. 커피 농장은 이 에콜라지 주변으로 계속 만들어져 있는데요. 커피 등급 역시 최우수 등급을 받았습니다. 보시는 것처럼 레인포레스트 얼라이언스로부터 우수 등급을 인증을 받았고요. 유기농으로 재배를 하시기 때문에 생태적으로 아주 건강한 농장을 갖고 계십니다. 관련해서는 조금 더 설명을 나중에 글렌 잠폴로부터 직접 들어보도록 하겠습니다. 말씀드렸던 이 곳을 설명해주는 비디오를 잠시 시청해 보시도록 하겠습니다.
Hi, my name is Ulises Zúñiga. I am the coffee tour guide of Finca Rosa Blanca. We are in approximately 1,200 meters above the sea level. That's part of what makes a really good quality of coffee, high elevations of Costa Rica. We are working with a whole symbiosis with trees, with plants, and with the coffee plantation. Always surrounded by more than 60 different species of trees. I'm standing right now at the very beginning of the Finca Rosa Blanca farm. In this plantation, at the beginning, when there were not many trees, we had approximately 50, 60 different species of birds. Now, with the trees that we have here, more than 7,000 trees, this become like a home for all of that wildlife. More than 130 different species of birds, even endemic birds that are endangered in the country. Cabanis is ground sparrow, one of the most important, as the way that we call it in Spanish, pinzón cafetalero. These type of birds are birds that we are not going to find all over the country, but in coffee plantations. We are talking about conservation, and at the same time, we are working with the environment. That story that they always tell me, that I love to hear, is how they convert, how they turn a conventional plantation where it was just coffee, it was just maybe chemicals, into something like this, something beautiful, into a forest, in a home for wildlife. So trees, plants, mammals, birds, and also insects is part of what we can experience in the plantation. So for us, this practice, coffee, tourism, ecotourism, will be like a tool for us to educate people about how important the conservation is. This is a way for us to share and to help a little bit our planet.
예, 아마 잘 보셨을 걸로 생각을 합니다. 보시는 것처럼 커피 농장으로 보이지만 또 저것이 생태 숙박 시설이기도 합니다. 우리 커피 가이드가 설명해 준 것처럼 저것이 처음부터 저렇게 숲을 이루고 있었던 것은 아닌데요. 글렌 잠폴과 그 가족이 이곳에 커피 농장을 만들게 된 것이 생태 숙박시설로 먼저 시작하면서 생태관광 개념을 도입하고 그래서 그 자연을 복원했다고 보시면 됩니다. 그러면 글렌 잠폴을 모시고 국제 생태관광에 대해서 들어보도록 하겠습니다. Hi, Glenn.
Hello.
Thank you very much to take this lecture for our participants. Could you briefly say hello to the audience and introduce Global Ecotourism Network?
Sure. Thank you, Mihi. It's so great to see you again and be here with all the people from Costa and to talk about things that we all probably love a lot, including me. For those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the Global Ecotourism Network. which is a umbrella organization covering the whole planet of ecotourism networks. And below our umbrella and what we cover is, or are, 6 global regional networks from all parts of the world. The Asian Ecotourism Network, which many of you, I'm sure, are part of, the African Ecotourism Network, the Middle Eastern and North African Ecotourism Network, European Ecotourism Network, North American Ecotourism Network, and the Latin American and Caribbean Ecotourism Network. And each of these regional networks have a representation in the global ecotourism network where they can talk about things that are important to them and have representatives who will be part of the board. We're still finalizing that part of our structure. We've been an organization since 2015. All of the founding board members were previously advisory board members for the International Ecotourism Society. And due to some very serious problems and ethical issues that we could not supersede, we decided to form a new, more transparent and more ethical organization, which we call the Global Ecotourism Network. So I'm here today partly as representative for the Global Ecotourism Network. We call it GEN for short, G-E-N. But I'm also here because I'm an old friend of Mihi's, and she's one of the most important people in Asia representing ecotourism and its evolution. So I'm very happy to be part of her circle and to meet all of the people that she helps and influences in your part of the world.
Thank you very much. It's a very exciting movement globally. We all have a regional network. It can help regional movement. So usually Western society led ecotourism development or the stories, but I think we in Asia have a lot of things to share globally, and then we can have our own strategy. So thank you so much to lead this movement globally. I'm very proud of Jane and the leaders, especially you, Glenn Jampol.
Thank you.
So my second question is about definition of ecotourism. You know, people still use the definition of the ties defined in the past. But could you explain more, or if you interpret it differently from the definition we always had in the past? But you know, to understand easily, could you emphasize what kinds of elements ecotourism should have?
Yes, well, the definition from TIES, the International Ecotourism Society, was developed more than 20 years ago and has evolved a lot. But the definition that people see nowadays and that are using is a definition that was developed and brought to people's knowledge by the advisory board of TIES from 2005 to 2014, which is all of the new board members from GEN. So we could safely say that the board members of GEN are the ones who actually wrote the ecotourism definition. But what we do in terms of using the definition to support ecotourism and the concept of it pretty much is the same in terms of what we're trying to communicate to the world, but we've added very fine little points to it as we continue on our journey. One of them being that we always had written to increase or to help the well-being of local peoples, which is very important. But in Gen, we also added to that and indigenous peoples, because we feel that there's been a little bit of conglomeration where everything is put together in the same pot. And we needed to be specific about this. But I think our job now is not so much to create new definitions or to try to bring forth completely new vision about ecotourism, because it's basically still that wonderful idea of nature-based, responsible tourism. But it is important to distinguish between ecotourism, sustainable tourism, regenerative tourism, and things like that, because they often get mixed together, and many times they are all together with one concept, but they're not necessarily the same thing. So to be a little bit short in this, because it's a long topic that requires a lot of conversation, but a business can be an ecotourism business, but not necessarily sustainable. And ecotourism, therefore, should have and implies responsibility. But when you talk about sustainable tourism, it's not just nature-based tourism. It can be an urban hotel in the middle of a city. It could be a small little boutique hotel in an agricultural area. Whereas ecotourism generally are businesses that use nature and the beauty of nature and education to bring people to far off places where they can really disconnect. And within that business, we would hope that they would be very what used to be called sustainable, but now we're saying regenerative, because we've passed that point where we can just sustain what we're doing. We need to rebuild it. So in ecotourism, we're hoping to get a practice of regeneration and responsibility.
Thank you. I think generally people can understand the concept of ecotourism, but everybody may have a different, image of ecotourism. As you know, most Asian countries are highly populated, and there are communities everywhere. So therefore, operational definition of ecotourism could be applied a bit differently to Asian countries from United States or Latin America or Africa, having vast wilderness area with no community at all. And there are a lot of animals. Of course, some of the countries in Asia, they have tigers, elephants, and other, big cats. But like Korea, we don't have those, big animals. But of course, we really try to restore the animals already extincted here. And we have a much more secondary forests, or even like a Southern area, reclaimed lands, because it's such a small country. So we tried to have, the bigger land. So what I want to say is, it could be a little bit difficult to have really away from the urbanized life, even inside of, ecotourism destinations. So what do you still think that's, ecotourism destinations, or we have to call it differently? So like a community-based tourism or agricultural tourism. What's your, thoughts on this situation?
Well, this is a very good point. I think the biggest important part of how ecotourism has come to be considered, and how it's grown and its evolution. The most important internal part of that is that it's small numbers tourism. It's not mass tourism. And in the beginning, when we started to use the word ecotourism, it really meant tourism that had some respect for the planet, for green areas, for conservation. But over the years, the idea that started or spawned the word ecotourism has really evolved also, and it takes on some new meanings. For instance, if we say that ecotourism is only tourism in biodiverse areas, then we lose all of that kind of tourism where you would go to a cultural center where an ancient culture has survived and is still incredibly interesting and still supports through tourism the local peoples. There are places, for instance, in Jordan. One of the board members of GEN, of the Global Ecotourism Network, GEN, is Nabil Tarasi, who is from Jordan, and he owns and runs an eco-lodge called Feynan. And Feynan has really no green, nothing around it green. It's in the desert. But the beauty of the geology and the area, together with the Bedouin people who have been there for thousands of years, nomadic peoples, learning about those things within the setting of a desert still probably fits into what we would call ecotourism, yet there's no green, lush, biodiverse elements around. The biodiversity is really a geological diversity. So I think understanding that, we have to talk about a new kind of regenerative tourism, and still consider ecotourism as small scale, locally empowered, off the beaten track tourism of small individual groups or individual people, and that would benefit the well-being of those indigenous peoples who run these organizations and benefit the process of educating tourists so they understand how important conservation and community involvement is for the survival of our planet.
Thank you very much. But here, another question related to definition. You also mentioned the small number of the tourist group. So the small number could be interpreted differently according to destination's situation. So with that is carrying capacity, maybe. But usually, how many people can you allow, for a tour?
Yeah, there is no strict definition in terms of volume or number, but I think people understand that when you get to a certain point where you no longer feel as though you're participating, but rather a spectator, that's the point in which you lose the sense of what ecotourism and what small-scale tourism can be. There's a saying in English that is, if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, then it is a duck. So we can often defend certain, or there are those who defend certain tourism sites as being ecotourism or sustainable tourism, yet they really are fomenting a large-scale tourism, which is not part of what we would consider as the attributes we're looking for in ecotourism. We're not saying that mass tourism is the worst thing that ever happened. although I personally think that it's very difficult to swallow. But what we're saying is that any tourism should be responsible tourism and consider certain factors which are going to benefit the communities and the planet and reduce the footprint of negative impact that the tourist would have. But those aren't necessarily ecotourism destinations. They might just be green destinations, as they're sometimes called, or responsible tourism destinations. But whatever word we use, as Shakespeare once said, rose by any other name would still smell sweet. We want to get people educated and to understand that everything they do when they travel has an impact, and hopefully the positive impacts will be greater than the negative impacts.
It's a great answer. I really enjoyed your explanation about my silly questions. So let me move on to the next question. You have experienced lots of cases of ecotourism development in different destinations. What do you think the biggest challenge in ecotourism development?
Well, there's kind of two sections to that answer. The first section is working with local governments and the people in control. Sometimes you find yourself in a position where you're working with politicians or government entities that have a specific plan in mind for the growth of their job. They want to become even more successful as a politician, or they want to consider the whole community as a stepping stone. And so they find what's called the common denominator, and they try to look for attributes that would help their community and help their career at the same time. This is a little bit cynical of me to say this, but I have been in this situation many times, and I understand the politics of development, any kind of development. Generally, when you talk about development, whether it's tourism or any other kind of development, there's money involved, and there are jobs that will be created, hopefully. And those jobs are the pin that holds the hinge in place so that they can open the door to this kind of development. So when you're talking about ecotourism, which is generally, as we discussed earlier, a kind of small scale tourism, and you're competing with perhaps, let's say for a hotel on the beach that has 1,000 rooms, as opposed to a small hotel with 15 or 20 rooms, the general governmental attitude will often be, well, with the 1,000-room hotel, we're going to generate 800 jobs, and they'll pay a lot of taxes from the sales. And this little hotel that's run by Mexican and her family are going to only have 15 or 20 rooms, and they're only going to generate 40 jobs. So really what we need here is to think about the well-being of our people. So what we would call the long-term strategy, which is, this may be true now, but in 10 or 15 or 30 or 50 years, we might see that this area is completely devastated by so many people touching the soil here and leaving their debris and not understanding their impact. So having said that, the part one is we need to build bridges of education and training with our local communities and our government to understand that we're just renters here in our planet. We don't own anything. And we need to really take care that we leave something for a legacy for our children, our grandchildren, our great-grandchildren. And by creating developments or projects that take into account the long-term strategy, often can have some positive impact on the governmental decisions. We've seen that now more than ever as people are becoming more aware of climate change and other issues and cultural impacts. The second part is that really when you create a development that is and should be following the concepts of responsible tourism, you have to think about not only creating jobs for a group of people, and not only about doing the right thing in terms of how you buy, how you use your waste, how you save water, what kind of natural resources you're using, how you're working with the environment, but you also have to think about how you're going to sustain that business so that all of these things that you're doing, which have a strong component of education to your guests and to your staff, how you're going to keep that going. So it becomes a business proposition. Sustainability becomes financial sustainability. And then you have a second set of challenges because you need to have a net income in order to continue doing business. So the sacrifices that you need to make along the way so that you continue or sustain your financial success is very important in the considerations of everything else. So it becomes a double-edged sword, as we say, and you need to, as a developer, take into consideration. At some point in the future, we can talk about a project that I developed conceptually. It's never taken hold because I haven't had the time to really go into detail, but it's called Incenso. And basically the idea is that as a developer and understanding that companies who want to develop tourism projects often are counting every single day because when they develop a project, they have a lot of money invested, and every day that the project is not up and running and making money, they're losing that investment. You offer incentives through the government to give them a very fast track to get all of their paperwork done and all of their permits granted if and when they adhere to sustainable strategies of education, of regeneration, of sustainable products, and that they maintain that level of responsibility throughout the years of their business. By doing that, the government earns a respect and gets a project up and running quickly, and the project developers get to start operations as soon as possible and create a positive green image for themselves.
Thank you. It sounds like everywhere has the same issues.
One of the ways in which you can help your idea along as an ecotourism developer is to find the data that supports the financial positivity of doing small and sustainable or regenerative projects. One of the things that we used in Costa Rica, and I must say that as a caveat, Costa Rica already had a consciousness about protecting the environment, so it's much easier than many other countries to do this kind of development. But what we did in Costa Rica to enhance and to inspire government and local municipalities to believe in what we were doing was to show them some key components of positive financial results that ecotourism brings. And the most important of them for us, when we started doing this in the late 80s, 1980s, was to show the difference between Costa Rica and France. So France at that time, and still to this day, has the largest number of tourists in the world coming to see their country. I think now, well, before the pandemic, there was probably over 80 million people who visited France in a year, probably closer to 90 million. And if you looked at the spend is the term we use for how much money a tourist leaves in the country, dollars or euros or whatever currency you're using. So for these 80 million people who visited France in 2018 to 2019, they left about $30 billion of money in the country. And for Costa Rica, which is a tiny country and has only pretty much small scale tourism, our largest hotel in this country, and there are very few large hotels. The largest hotel in this country, I think, has 400 rooms. And most of the large hotels are 120 rooms or 150 rooms, not the 1,000 room hotels you'll see in Spain and other places. And in Costa Rica, we only had 3 million visitors. It's compared to France, we're like babies. But they spent over $3.5 billion here as the spend. So if you compare per tourist what the ecotourist, who is Costa Rica's main tourist here, people who are looking for biodiversity and for cultural and educational experiences and for small scale tourism, versus France, which is really all kinds of tourism, but not a whole lot of ecotourism. In France, $150. But in Costa Rica, it's over $1,000. So the argument is these people who come to Costa Rica spend more than twice as much because of ecotourism and responsible tourism than they do in France.
Yeah, that's great. You explained, already about the Costa Rica tourism, but can you explain more what made Costa Rica as a successful ecotourism destination?
Well, a big part of it, as I mentioned earlier, is the consciousness, the culture of Costa Rica as a country and in its society. They're very, very proud of their country because of its biodiversity. All Costa Ricans have been in school and their whole lives have learned that for such a tiny country, it has 6% of all of the biodiversity on the planet. That means that 6% of all species that are known to exist anywhere can be found in Costa Rica. So if you look at other countries, most countries are lucky if they have 1% or 0.5%. Some countries are huge and they might have 3 or 4%, but for the per square meter, Costa Rica has the most biodiversity of anywhere on the planet. And so this has been something that the Costa Ricans have been taught and are very proud of. And during the last 60 or 70 years, when Costa Rica had a very large change in its culture, they had a revolution, civil war, which didn't last very long, and the civil war was about voting rights and things like that. but the general who won the war, or who was the head of the rebel group who ultimately won the war, when he took command of the government, he said that from now on, the first order of business for Costa Rica is to abolish the army, because there's nothing good that comes out of war. The second thing, he said, is that we're going to take all the money that we were spending on war materials, on army, on training, and we're going to put it into education and culture. And his famous statement was, no more guns, just violins. And the third thing that they did was to say that all medicine, welfare, health, education, even university education would be free to all Costa Rican citizens. So that automatically started a sense of it's about the people. And in the 1970s, as this evolved, the environmental activists, and again, when we say environmental activists for Costa Rica, we're way ahead of most people because the country as a culture is already somewhat activist. So these environmental activists decided that with all this biodiversity and all these amazing primary forests and natural habitats, we need to protect them even more. So they created the national park system, which dedicated 25% of all of the land in Costa Rica to national parks. So then from there, you can imagine how things went on. So for us as a country, we already have kind of sewn into the fabric of our coat the idea that environment and the pride of our country as an environmental wonder is something that should be celebrated just like we celebrate famous scientists or Nobel Peace Prize winners or many other things. In the 1990s, we elected a president whose name was Figueres. His last name was Figueres. And he was actually the son of that famous general I told you about who abolished the army. And he was a very strong environmental advocate as well. And through the Ministry of Tourism, and through some studies that we had done here in Costa Rica to determine who was our client, who was the tourist that was coming to Costa Rica, and why were they coming to Costa Rica, and what were they looking for, we decided that what was really selling our country and what was increasing the amount of tourists at a very fast rate every year was exactly that, our environmental consciousness and the warmth and loving pacifist people that we had here. And so we decided that you could say that you were a responsible tourism entity and you could talk about it all you wanted, but we really needed to verify that. And so we started and created the certification for sustainable tourism. And the government decided at the same time that this was so important and that tourism, because it represented almost, at that time, almost 10% of the gross national income, that the government itself needed to walk the walk, as they say in English. They needed to support sustainable tourism and that they would pay for the sustainable tourism certification that would come out of the country's funds. It would be a free certification, voluntary, and it would become part of the brand of our country. That really took hold, and it not only became part of our country brand and our tourism embraced it, but it also turned out that it was a great guide for small businesses to reduce their waste and reduce many things, which help them also reduce their costs. When you're spending less money on buying small items like shampoo bottles and conditioner and soaps that all have a plastic wrapper, and you're buying large gallons of liquid soap and liquid shampoo and putting them in dispensers, these small businesses discovered, well, we're spending so much less on these kinds of things, and we have a smaller impact on the environment because we're not creating waste of plastic products. So these kinds of revelations of epiphanies created even more interest in developing sustainability. And Costa Rica has really used this as a tool for the growth of the country and the growth of tourism. And in conclusion, the government has also applied your willingness and your participation in sustainability to things that are important on a global level. For instance, my hotel, Finca Rosa Blanca, has a status which we call elite, which is the top level of sustainability. And part of the award or reward that we receive for that is that when the government marketing for tourism goes to any tourism fair anywhere in the world, the ITB, the World Travel Mart, Fitur in Spain, anywhere, Costa Rica always does an amazing job with a huge stand to sell the country. And they give all of the hotels and businesses that have an elite status as a certified business free participation. They pay for them to have their little booth or their stand there, and there's no entry cost at all.
That's great. So it's naturally leading me to ask about your ecology. Maybe the participant of this session is not familiar with the concept of ecology. Could you explain what ecology is with the example of Finca Rosa Blanca?
Yeah, that's a great question. And when we started the sustainable tourism certification, we had a body who was the governing body of it, which was called the National Accreditation Commission. It was a group of about 10 people plus the Minister of Tourism who received all of the reports from the inspectors and listened to their suggestions in terms of what level they should be approved at or not approved at. And that group of people would then discuss among themselves and accept the recommendations of the inspectors or reject them. And this group was made up of university professors like yourself, Dr. Mihi, by environmental organizations, by the Chamber of Ecotourism businesses, and many more, the UICN representative in Costa Rica. And at one point, a group of hotel resort owners that were in the jungles and the cloud forests, very far away from civilization, came and asked for a meeting with our commission. And they said, we're eco-lodges out in the middle of nowhere, and we want to have a special branch of the CST, which is eco-lodges that are really, we have more difficulty getting materials, we have more difficulty getting foodstuffs, we have more difficulty with transportation, but we're doing so much for conservation, and we're protecting hundreds or thousands of hectares of land. So we need our own certification. So we sent all of that information and all of the stuff we had done to one of our postgraduate universities here who specializes in sustainable development and sustainable tourism. And the professor who was in charge of that, whose name was Lawrence Pratt, he did the work on this issue for us to research it. And when he came back after studying it for many months, he came back unbeknownst to me, totally, and came before the whole ministry and the Commission for Accreditation for Sustainable Tourism and said, I looked through every single aspect and detail of the certification for sustainable tourism. And the only difference between sustainable certification and what we would call eco lodges that are way out in the middle of nowhere is that they're just far away from everything and their transportation to those places is much more difficult. But on every other level, they should and must do all of these things that the sustainable tourism certification requires. And he said, I used Finca Rosa Blanca, which is my hotel, as the benchmark. He said, because they're not out in the middle of nowhere, they're actually easily accessible. They're in the Coffee Highlands and not that far from San Jose. And they're doing everything at 100%. So would I call them an eco lodge? He said, yes, because they're doing what ecotourism originally set out to do. So in my opinion, he said, I don't think we need to have a specific branch of certified sustainable tourism that would be called eco lodges. And that's where it kind of was left. So we've always taken the position that we're kind of the bridge between remote ecotourism, eco lodges, and all other kinds of lodges. In that we are a cultural, we're a biodiverse, we're very involved with the local community and the urban communities as well that are not that far, but we're not in the middle of nowhere. And we use all of the 4 pillars of our system very well, and people really feel like they're having a small scale biodiverse eco-lodge experience, but we're not in the middle of the jungle.
Yeah, I think many people may think eco-lodge is about only eco-friendly material used buildings or the energy efficient, buildings. But according to your explanation, it's beyond of, eco building. It should engage local community and then give positive benefits to not only environment, but also to the community. Is that correct?
Yes, and there's lots of mythology around this. People in the early days, we're talking about how you should not use wood because then you're cutting down trees. You should use cement blocks or things like that. And it turns out when people start doing research on building materials and things like that, they find out that the heat necessary to make concrete, cement for concrete, it generates way more CO2 and is much more damaging than it is for farmed lumber or fallen lumber. Many things happen. In Costa Rica, we didn't put the immense pressure of building materials on what we talked about. We talked more about how you use the building materials. For instance, you might not use super sustainable, lightweight, recycled plastic posts and beams, but in your main room you have skylights so that you don't need electricity all day long. You've created what we call venturis of channeling air so that it flows freely through the space, reducing the need or eliminating the need for air conditioning. We take into account what is the final impact. What is the final footprint that you have compared to doing something else conventionally? We put way more impact or focus on 4 different things. One is the environmental involvement, protection, using non-chemical ingredients, recycling if you can, consciousness about what you're using, reducing your waste, saving water, etc. Second, we talk about involvement in our communities, not showing the community how to be sustainable only, but to participate in your community, helping them together learn how to save water, how to reduce stress on our water systems, how to educate children in schools, creating sustainable gardens in schools, working in the community with the people in the government and the counselors of the government to understand why tourism is important when it's responsibly done, and having a place in your community, not just the star sitting on the side of the hill that nobody can get to. Hiring local people only. We have 100% local people working for us. The third pillar is educating and training all of your guests and all of your staff about why you do what you do and why it's important and how you should make decisions in the future about where to go and why that's important, and supporting organizations and businesses that support conservation, support indigenous peoples, things like that. And the fourth that we concentrate on is service to the client, quality with efficiency, creating unforgettable experiences, appealing to the core values of all of the people who come here, and also the pride of our country and what we stand for and what we've been doing, so that people who leave here will maybe go to another place and say, I was just in Costa Rica and everybody there does this and this and this and this, and you don't do any. Don't you think you would be better off if you helped the community more, or you did more with your conservation efforts? So ecotourism has had many, many hats, and it's used as a term very broadly. But what's most important is just the responsibility of understanding how important it is to reduce your personal and your business impact on the planet.
Thank you. What do you think? Ecolodge is always look for luxury items, or is there any way to build ecolodges for more the general tourists who really look for nature experience and experience with the local community?
Yes, I think there's room for all of it. I think one of the reasons that you see luxury a lot with small boutique hotels that are sustainable is that a lot of the work that they did and are doing sometimes was revolutionary work, pioneering work, which required investments. And they realized that the only way they could fuel this fire of ecology and health and biodiversity was through being able to bring people who didn't care about price, they cared about value. And so they built a structure, a business structure that was based on how much they really needed to earn in order to continue doing what they were doing, to innovate, to educate, and to donate. And the prices were deemed necessary in order to stay alive financially. And the people who were their clients and who continued to come were not interested in or were not at all bothered by how expensive it was on whatever level, because they were getting what they expected or more than they expected. But I think in Costa Rica you can find both. You can find very, very low backpacker, wonderful experiences that may not be that luxurious, and the food might be very plain. You can find kind of really nice but mid-range When you were in Costa Rica, we stayed at Selva Verde Lodge, which I would say is in that level. Is very comfortable and open, but it had not a lot of luxury, but you were at the Sarapiquí River and you know how many birds we saw. And then there's places like mine, which are really about creating revenue to do more organic farming and to create new projects and to help our community. So we have everything.
Yeah, thank you. And then it could be my last question about Eco Guide. We really enjoyed the video he took. And then most of our participants here are Eco Guides and also, you know, leading bird watching, because Seosan Chonsuman Bay is, you know, globally important migratory bird habitat. So they are, you know, kind of expert in bird watching. But generally, how important is Eco Guide in ecotourism? And what kind of qualification the Eco Guide have to have?
Well, this is a great question and it's so important. There's a really old saying, an old question that I love, which is, what is truer than the truth? And the answer is the story. The story is everything. You can take somebody into the most beautiful forest in the world and they're going to look around and love it and enjoy it. But a good storyteller, a guide who knows the story behind that tree, how his grandfather saved his life by tapping into the tree when he was injured and covering his wound with a salve made from the sap of that tree, and the stories that come make the biggest difference there is in sustainable and ecotourism. And here in Costa Rica, part of our culture is that people are very good storytellers. They like at a party to tell a story about something. It's part of the culture. And so the guides here in Costa Rica and some other countries too that I've been in are wonderful guides because they tell the story of what people are enjoying and seeing and participating in. And that has a formal name, which is interpretation. And interpretation is the most important part of guiding, because the difference between a good interpretive guide and a guide who just knows the scientific names of the trees and goes about, oh, that's a coral tree, and over there, that's a lagartillo tree, and that, as opposed to saying, you see that tree over there with the little spines? That's a lagartillo tree. And that tree has a seed that only comes once a year for 1 week. And in all the migratory birds in that area flock to that tree, and they all sit and eat the seeds at the same time. And it's like a culture, it's like a coexisting group of individuals who are saying, we're all different. I'm a northern oriole, I'm a squirrel cuckoo, but we get along because we love the beauty and the food this tree gives us. The difference between that story and just saying that's a lagartillo tree, that's a tata tree, is immense. And I think it's so important that guides, one, learn how to be good actors, how to tell the story, not only by telling the words, but telling the story with their hands, with their face, with their eyes, and loving what they do, and learning all of the details, because the clients who love ecotourism also love to learn. And so it's really important as a guide that you learn all of the, not only the science behind what you're guiding and the history of it, but also all of the stories about that place that make people so interested in it. You know, the difference between going into an old house and saying, this house was built in 1650, and you look around and go, wow, it's beautiful, look at the wood, as opposed to somebody saying, in this house in 1650, there was a family, and they were called the Ramirez family. And everybody in the community knew the Ramirez family because they gave all of their extra money to the community. And one day, and you go on and you go on, and people are like, oh, this is so great. They'll never forget that story, and they'll never forget that place. And that's good for business too, because then they go back and tell all of their friends and their other business partners, you should go to Korea. It is the most beautiful place, and the culture that's there, the pottery that they made, and all the pottery in Japan that Japan's so famous for actually came from Korea. These are the people who invented these things. And you know, all of a sudden, Korea is not just a country in Asia, it's the place where all of these stories started that other countries adopted. And this is why guiding should be a learning experience, like to be a doctor or to be an architect or to be a good driver. Anything requires time spent, a love of what you do, and really understanding all of the levels that make this place important or this idea important.
Thank you. So it's a time to close our session. So do you have any recommendation or something you want to tell our participants?
Well, I would just say to everybody, thank you for letting me go on and on and on about all of these things. I'm very passionate about it, you know, and I've certainly made my mistakes and have learned a lot from them. And if you love to travel, traveling is the best way to understand the people, the culture, and the human race. It's also a good way to eliminate hate and prejudice and racism and misogyny and all of these things that are destroying our culture. And also it's your turn to make a difference and to reduce your impact and to also educate everybody around you why it's so important as a traveler to be responsible and to do your homework and to you know, help local communities and indigenous people survive.
Thank you. It was a very honor for us to have you, a pioneer of ecotourism and the father of ecotourism. And then we really look forward to having you in person and then have more time to learn and share our stories. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you very much. And all of you, come to Costa Rica and visit us.
Thank you.